Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Yvette Jackson. Yvette is an adjunct professor at Teachers College at Columbia University. She's also been a visiting lecturer at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, Stanford University, Rutgers University, and California State University at Chico. Honestly, the academic accolades are endless. Yvette is also the winner of the 2019 Global Mind Ed Inclusive Leader Award. She is the author of The Pedagogy of Confidence, which received the 2012 Forward Review's Silver Book Award. And that book, The Pedagogy of Confidence, is the reason I've primarily invited Yvette to the podcast today. She is an internationally recognized leader in her work in equity consciousness. She serves as a senior scholar for the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education. She works with school district superintendents, principals, leaders around the world. Honestly, she's been published in a number of books and educational journals. Listeners, we would need an entire podcast to go through all of the resume. It is an impressive, impressive career. So with that, Yvette, I want to welcome you to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thank you. And I'm going to say to the audience, I am honored to be with Tom too, because if you're listening to this show, then you know how good he is and what his background is as well. So this is touche, and thank you.
Well, I want to just be upfront with everyone to let them know that I did not pay you to say that. So I really appreciate it.
That's right.
I honestly, I am thrilled to have you here through my friend and colleague, Anthony Muhammad. I was introduced to your work a number of years ago. I read The Pedagogy of Confidence and was just absolutely impressed and blown away by just so much of what that book has to offer for educators and even non-educators. And then when I started this podcast, I thought to myself, you are definitely somebody that I wanted to have on the podcast. So I'm grateful that you're here and I really appreciate it. And I don't want to waste any time here. I want us to dig in because I just know how much you bring to the conversation and how much we benefit. So I want to begin with a bit of a history lesson for listeners who might be less familiar with how we've kind of ended up where we are today. This disenfranchisement of urban students, predominantly Black and brown students, is really no systemic accident. I'm not pointing the finger at individuals, but we've kind of created a kind of systemic inertia that has become in many ways just kind of assumed. And so those who are less familiar with that might think to themselves, so we have this system of special education and there's a process for that. And we have this system of, gifted and talented programs and there's a process for that. But as is often pointed out by yourself and others, Black and brown students are likely to be overrepresented in special education, and white students tend to be overrepresented in gifted and talented programs. So I wonder if, to begin with, you could take us inside a bit of a history lesson and some of the social underpinnings that have kind of led to where we are today with those categories in our education system.
Right. Sure. It's my pleasure. And I was even thinking, as I was saying, it's my pleasure when I think about the categories. It's not my pleasure to talk about them because they've been so restrictive. But if you go back, it's really interesting. The first thing I want to say is when you talk about minorities, and if I'm doing quote signs because we'll talk about that later, the idea that minorities don't do as well on standardized achievement tests, then we have to really go back and say, well, why is that? It has nothing to do with their race. It has to do with what people have been introduced to, what they've been instructed in. So what do I mean by that? So in the 1910s, the people who were considered the minorities who didn't do well on standardized achievement tests were the Irish. They came over, right? This was after the potato famine. My grandmother was Irish. Her family came over. And because they came into this culture and were alienated from the time they got off the boat, they would go to school, and they didn't have the regular standardized achievement tests like we have now, but there was definitely grading and grouping and systematizing people, and they were considered those people who wouldn't do as well. And then after that, in the 1920s, it was Eastern Europeans who were coming over into the United States. Same thing, they would come into this country. And it's interesting because this country was founded by immigrants. And now these later, these new immigrants were considered the minorities. They don't do as well. They're not part of the culture. And then it was like in the 1950s that what started happening is Latino people, Hispanic people were coming up, not even so much from Mexico, but from some of the other places. And they were actually being identified as the new minorities and not doing well. And then you would say, okay, well, that's interesting. I haven't heard you say African Americans yet. You know, there were, well, that's because the segregation was so deep before that they were not even considered to need to have the file kept on how they were doing because of the segregation. But then what wound up happening is in the 60s, that is when you started with looking at the whole idea as of the Freedom Trail, how we were really looking at Martin Luther King and what we were trying to do against segregation, to break the back of segregation. But you still had segregated minds, which means that the idea of looking at a person of color, and particularly African Americans, as a result of enslavement and how they were really considered very early on not even to have intelligence. But now what happened, because they were considered that, education was kept away, right? It was you don't need to go to school. As a matter of fact, we're going to segregate the schools. And that's where we have all of these different court cases that came up, separate but equal. What does that really mean? At the same time, then in the 70s, that is really where a congressman, his name was Augustus Hawkins, was one of the first congressmen to really push forward the Title I Act in the United States. And what he meant by that, and he was actually one of the mentors of the National Urban Alliance. So we knew Gus personally, and his desire with Title I was to say what I say in the book, that children have unbelievable capacity. We need to ensure that they are being given the kind of funding so they can do better in school. But this is where the rub happened. What happened was they started deciding, how are you going to disseminate the money for Title I? And the way districts were applying for it was based on looking at low academic performance. Now, Gus's idea was, yes, that just means they need more enrichment. It doesn't mean that they're less capable. But what happened was, the more you could identify where there was, and they didn't use the word underachievement, I've used that word, they would say where you could identify low achievement, the more you could identify, the more money you would get for Title I. Now, what happened was, some people would say, well, that's really great, except what started happening is remediation came as a result of that, not enrichment. It was remediation. That was number one. What does that mean? Doing the same thing over and over again. That's why it's called remediation, doing it over and over, which if you teach somebody a certain way and they're not getting it, say, well, I'm just going to do it again the same way, they're still not getting it. But this is the big rub. What happened was there was so much emphasis at looking at deficits that nobody started looking at strengths. The more that came about, meaning ignoring the possibility of strengths, then the inference became, well, they must not have any strengths, right? We're not looking, all we keep identifying is where they're weak. And we know right now, you know, when I work with teachers that I tell the story, I said, suppose I started this session with you by saying, I want to know all the areas you don't do well in. I want to know that, and for the entire sessions we're together, I'm just going to focus there. First of all, the teachers would be very turned off by me. That's number one. Number two, they would get this inferiority complex thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm not capable. And this is what started happening as a result of what Gus wanted as being a very supportive, enriching experience, got really reframed and refocused on the idea of deficits, which really propelled this idea of substantiating that people of color just obviously don't do well, because that's where, for Title I, you could get the money, like I said, based on underachievement or based on poverty. Those were the two. So here we go. You put those two together and look, wow, voila. Now, exactly at the same time, though, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the United States became competitive with Russia for the space program.
Right.
The space program was, and all of a sudden, the United States is saying, wait a second, we have to have people we're identifying as really highly capable giving money in that venue that we'll call these people gifted. Okay, but now what did they say? 3 to 5% of a population we're going to label as gifted. Now, why that? Because they figured by giving a statistic, a range of 3 to 5%, then they could really hold on to how much money they really have to allocate for that. But people then interpreted that by saying, well, only 3 to 5% of a population then is gifted. That is totally empirically not true. They
Right.
never did that kind of testing to see that at all. So then what happened was, well, what do you mean by gifted? Well, high performing and standardized achievement tests. Okay, but wait, we really are trying to do this. This is what the government was saying. We're really trying to do this to perpetuate those who could make contributions to this dominance that we want to try to continue to have. So what wound up happening is that's when they started saying, well, wait, you could be gifted a variety of ways. You could be intellectually gifted, which would mean we're going to find that out on an IQ test. You could be academically gifted. We're going to find that out on an academic test. You could be performing. You could be gifted in the performing arts, the performing visual arts. Okay, then we're going to assess that based on performance. And then they had even gotten into this idea of looking at sports. You could be gifted in sports. And then all of a sudden the government was saying, wait a minute, we're spending a lot of money now on Little League, on hockey teams, and we're going to take that, all right, we can't have that as a category anymore. So you had two tracks going on then. You had the track of Title I that now the focus was on where are students not doing well in poverty? And then you have this other track that said, okay, these are the kids who are really going to be making a contribution to the world just based on test scores, which a test score cannot predict how well you do later on. As a matter of fact, a lot of people know the work of Daniel Goleman, who really talks about emotional intelligence. And he always says, like, if you're really going to talk about people who wind up being leaders in particular, whatever particular areas, these are not people who were in gifted programs or who were valedictorian or anything. They had these other capacities, characteristics, habits of mind that got developed. Okay, so now I started teaching in the 70s, and that's why I kind of give that frame, because I was watching these two things happen, and I happened to teach in a Title I school. I would say 95% of the children in the school, maybe 98%, were kids of color. And I had the great opportunity, though, to teach the same kids for 3 years, right? Yeah. So I had them in 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade. Well, I became very Piagetian of them, because now I'm saying, oh my goodness, in this group of kids, I could just see the kind of gifts be identified. It was interesting because I had really been classically trained in the open school methodology, which meant a lot of centers, a lot of variety, a lot of choice. And it was that kind of pedagogy that elicited these kinds of performances on the parts of kids. And that's when I said, wait a second, these kids are truly gifted. They have been, what they've been showing, what they've been demonstrating has really been magnificent. And so I just knew later on. So then when I went to graduate school, I said, you know what? I am going to get a degree in gifted education, and I'm going to go into it not because I believe only 3 to 5% of kids are gifted. It's like, what do you do for students? What do you give them when they're labeled as gifted, right? Well, one thing is they're constantly getting invitations to push the frontier of their own intelligence, literally. They're getting invitations to use strengths, which means strengths are identified. You know, they are given, and even where they might be underachieving, underdeveloped areas, because not gifted all the way around, then you say, well, those kids could get different kinds of resources and enrichment. And that's when I was looking at that and saying, this is exactly what all kids need. Wait a second. And even the defining of gifted as saying, these are the individuals who are going to make contributions. Wait a second. We are all born. We are all put here on this earth to make contributions, whatever kind of, that's why we're here. And that was when I then decided I was going to go into that avenue of study. But then I also noticed that even within the sphere of students I'm talking about, there were some kids who traditional education, just even with the approaches I was using, just wasn't really working for them the way I would like. And that was when I found my mentor, whose name was Reuben Feuerstein, who was a student of Jean Piaget. So I learned and really became entrenched in cognitive development. This is before neuroscience really had its applications in the domain of education. But Reuben's whole theory was the unlimited capacity of the brain. And he not only studied that capacity being a student of Jean Piaget's, but then said, well, wait a minute, what holds some students back is the idea of stress. And he literally studied students who had grown up during World War II and had been, he was an Orthodox Jew and studied kids who had gone into concentration camps and had gone into orphanages, because at the end of the war, many of these students were then being able to go to Israel at that time. It was Palestine. It was called Palestine. They were going to Palestine. And Reuben was one of the cognitive assessors of the students as they were going in. They'd be tested in Paris, and then they would go to Palestine. And the idea was that the system, the government wanted to see, and they didn't use this word, but they were tracking kids, like how, who could go into what track. And that was when he was saying, wait a second, these kids have been through enormous stress. They didn't have the label of PTSD then, but he was showing how that stress had really affected their cognitive ability. And then he came out with a series of assessments that literally take 20 hours over time, because his whole thing was, you can't assess a child without knowing what they've been exposed to. Assessment should be part of the learning and teaching process. And when I read about his work, I said, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I need to involve myself in, to understand more the cognitive side of this, but also because it's not about remediation, it's about mediation. What are the kinds of things that we have to do to give students between the stimulus, the curriculum, or whatever they're learning, and their processing, so they'll get it deeply. And that was how my worlds intersected to go to. This is what Joseph Renzulli of University of Connecticut at Storrs would say, gifted. He would talk about studying gifted people, and he basically really saw that when he looked at gifted people who had been identified as gifted, alive or dead, he found that they really had three attributes. Otherwise, that were the same. Otherwise, they were very different. They were all above average. They were very task committed, and they were very creative. They weren't all off the spectrum on the chart of an IQ test. Anyway, so as you asked that question about what's the history, you had this Title I history going on, you had the gifted and talented, and I was saying, wait a second, I knew Gus, and Gus Hawkins wanted that same kind of idea of enrichment to be given to all students, and that's where I came up with this idea of the pedagogy of confidence.
Yeah, it's so I so appreciate the detail and the history lesson, because I think so often we sit in 2021 and we just make assumptions about the existence of certain programs, and can at times gloss over the history of where they came from as being more noble in their intent, right? You made me think of a couple of things there. One being this flaw in, first, well, let me take one step back. Nothing will otherize or marginalize a population like a label. Exactly. And then you incentivize people to label through funding, right? And all of a sudden you've got you've got this momentum where it's really hard to I suppose delabel people, because
Absolutely.
that comes with a loss of funding. That is just a
Absolutely.
really important lesson for us to all in 2021 not forget that. And again, we're not talking about special education in terms of those students with autism or
Right.
serious intellectual disabilities, et cetera. We're talking here about learning disabled, or those who get labeled low
Right.
achievers, et cetera. And we're going to come back to those labels, but
Right.
I think that's such an important history for all of us as educators to keep in mind, that
Yeah.
the 3 to 5% of the population being gifted was not the intent at all, and yet here we are
And here we are so many years
thinking,
later.
right.
The other thing is, when we talk about labels, here we are so many years later, but words like minority, that's a
Mm-hmm.
government label,
Yeah.
subgroup, that's a
Yeah.
government label, and
Yeah.
both of them mean less than. And
Right.
so now those titles are used as a lexicon that
Mm-hmm.
I call the lexicon of disbelief, because
Right.
what you're perpetuating is still this idea of they're less than, just by
Right.
saying minority. Now, part of my family is indigenous, right? And so you say in the
Right.
United States, wait a second, they were there before all you guys came over,
Right.
and you're still looking at this as a less than a
Yeah.
situation, which
Yeah.
I'm adamant about shifting.
Right. Absolutely. And
With that.
so with that shift comes the pedagogy of confidence. So let's start with just the idea of maybe give us a synopsis of, there's the history. Things kind of came together for you, and you started down this pathway. And then, of course, years later, you wrote the book Pedagogy of Confidence. So what is the pedagogy of confidence? What does that mean for those who haven't read the book? What does that really mean for educators?
Well, first of all, it means that you have the fearless expectation, fearless, and I use that word, that all students have the potential for high intellectual performances, not in everything, but nobody has that in everything. Einstein did not have that ability that
Exactly.
he identified for in everything. So the idea of the pedagogy of confidence is having that fearless expectation that when students are given the kinds of enriching experiences, mediational kinds of experiences, and the kind of experiences that push them to endeavor to work on the development of strengths and interests, because a strength has to start as an interest, which means it's about identifying those interests, cultivating those interests, and then getting to the point that students are demonstrating what it is that they really are gifted in. The other side of pedagogy of confidence, though, is what I call, well, what do you gift students with? What is the thing that we give them, that education that's usually associated with gifted programs? That was what we were talking about earlier, that in a pedagogy of confidence, that is what you give everybody. The idea of starting with their strengths, the idea of looking at relationship building, focusing on a high intellectual performance instead of just literacy, because literacy is like a code. In a very wealthy area, they don't say we focus on literacy. That's right. Like, are you kidding? If that's what you were presenting to the board, they would say, what? You've got to be talking about intellectual development here, right? And so in a pedagogy of confidence, that when you are providing those kinds of experiences, including having students be mindful, being able to be reflective, being able to connect their strengths and their cultural frames of references to learning experiences, you're going to see incredible growth. And that is, now when kids are growing like that, then we become more confident as the teachers. We go, wow, they really are capable. That's what happened to me. I said, gee, it's not so much I felt like I'm a good teacher. I just felt like I have the keys to unlocking what this innate potential is. Maybe I don't have all the keys, but that was how I pursued going through more and more studies. So in a pedagogy of confidence, it is that belief. Now that's really important, because to have belief in the capacity of students, teachers have to also have a belief in their own ability to unlock that capacity. And many teachers, because some students don't do well, they think maybe it's my inability, or they think, you know what, it can't be me, it's got to be them. It's got to be them. And in a pedagogy of confidence, it's, what do we do to really engage kids so that we can elicit that kind of the thing that we are wired for, and make that contribution. So that's what a pedagogy. And the other thing I want to say about that is when people ask me about equity, well, how do you define equity? And first of all, I say equity consciousness, because usually when people talk about equity, they're talking about policies. They're talking about making sure that maybe we've opened up the gifted programs to more kids or advanced placement. No, see, equity consciousness is, what do I have to be intentionally conscious about and pay attention to so I can really do this building, gifting our students with the kinds of strategies, opportunities, activities that are going to really inspire. See, that's a word. How come we don't hear that word across education? Kids getting inspired. And so a friend of mine and I, we wrote a book called, we use AIM, like affirmation, inspiration, and mediation. So it's called AIM High, but the point is, that's what we're saying here. The other thing, going back to equity, is that when people ask me to define, what are you talking about in terms of the consciousness, I use gifted education as the metaphor for equity consciousness, because everything I described earlier that we usually attribute to the kind of education we give to those labeled as gifted is exactly what equity consciousness is, except we're also intentionally being attentive to what are the barriers that could be holding back that potential for manifesting.
It's interesting because you talk in the book about motivation and connecting the idea. So early on in the book, I'm going to quote you here. You write, quote, "Student motivation to learn is directly affected by teachers' confidence in their students' potential," right? And it's also about their own competence to nurture that potential. And you were just talking about that. So it's interesting to me because I think that first part of the quote really does contradict some of the common narratives around motivation, which is that, it's up to the student to be motivated. It's internally sourced, it's intrinsic, all of that. And it's up to the student. So how do we know that? Like, maybe talk a little bit about the connection between a teacher's belief in their students to be successful and what that does as far as motivation is concerned.
Well, first, the brain, what the brain seeks, there are 5 things the brain really seeks. The brain wants to be awakened. It really wants to be opened up and awakened, and it wants to be engaged. I mean, from the time you are born and you are placed in a crib, why do parents put those mobiles on? Because the kid is lying there and looking up to be engaged. That's what otherwise they'd just be lying there. And if you find a child as a baby just lying there, still not looking around, there's something that's wrong. You've got to then see what kind of neurological issue, whatever kind of physiological issue, because babies are all over the place because we're wired to be motivated, but that is because the brain feels it needs to be engaged, though. It's looking for engagement. So when teachers say to me, well, you don't understand, or just some kids who are not motivated, I say, okay, so tell me about your engagement. What do you do when you're planning your lessons, when you're planning your pedagogy? Tell me how you set up the engagement part. And so sometimes they'll say, well, what do you mean? I said, you tell me what I mean. Okay. What engages you? What engages you? So the brain is often it's looking for those things that are culturally relevant. And that just means culture is not race. Culture is those things that are meaningful and relevant. Maybe it's those things that really spark my interest. They're those things that want me to be challenged, because I said there are 5 things the brain wants to be awakened. The brain wants engagement. It's searching for engagement. It wants to be challenged. That's why as soon as a baby gets out of a crib and is crawling, you better plug in all the outlets in that house. You better make sure nothing is hanging off the side of a table. Why? Because the brain's looking for the challenge. Ooh, there's an outlet there. Let me see what I can stick. I stuck wood in there. Nothing happened. Let me try the next thing. Let's see what happens. The brain is like that. But then the two other things that the brain wants, it wants to be able to reflect. It wants to think back on the experience that it's having, because that exercises the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which that amps up the ability to meet a challenge, right? That's it. And the other thing, the brain's always looking for feedback. It wants feedback. So those 5 things that I told you are exactly the 5 elements that computer games are made on. That's the ingredients for a computer game. What do I do to wake up the person who bought it? What's the engaging part? How do I challenge them? How do I give them immediate feedback and then allow them to use that feedback to reflect on to go to the next move? That's how we should be setting up our pedagogy in a class. What are we going to do to engage them? How do we wake them up to begin with? And it goes on through everything that I just shared with you. So when we say, well, where's the motivation? I've got to say, where's the engagement? Tell me about the engagement. So, there are many principles that talk to me now about with first they were talking to me about what do you do to virtually teach, right? Because when COVID hit, we went through this. So how do you still get engagement virtually? That was one. But now they're saying, now that we're going back to school, they're watching instruction, the principals, and they're saying teachers have felt the need to be restrictive in what they were doing just because of the technology, the lack of being close to. And so I'm bringing that up because now they'll say, so what should we be doing? And I said, well, wait a second. One of the things, this is an opportunity for a teacher to say, what am I personally passionate about? What is Yvette, if I'm the teacher, what am I personally passionate about? How do I take what I'm personally passionate about, find the concepts that kids have to learn within my syllabus, make a connection between what I'm passionate about and those concepts, the lexicon of the thing I'm passionate about, the skills that have to be used, the kinds of applications that are used, and start designing lessons right now as we're making this transition through COVID, after COVID, to this. This is what I was coining today. This is a renaissance period. This could be a renaissance, moving from COVID to really thinking very differently about how we do teaching, starting with teachers' passions and strengths. Because what happens when a child knows that you're really interested in something, that you love it, it's contagious. They feel the energy, and they know when you don't like something. They know, they can feel the energy. And so it's also modeling to them when they see what you're passionate about, what you went through, you're answering the questions. How'd you get good at that? These are the steps that I had to take. And usually they're the same steps. Somebody exposed me to something. I got interested in it. I decided to try it again and again because I was interested. Then I became innovative, whether it's skiing, cooking, whatever it happens to be, learning. So what I'm saying is right now, if teachers are motivated themselves to put together those kinds of lessons, then kids pick up. They're engaged, they pick up, and they will jump into it. So to say again that some kids aren't motivated, I have to ask, what's the engagement you're setting for? How do you connect to a child's cultural frame of reference? How do you know what a child finds personally meaningful and relevant? Just because you're looking at me and you see a person of color, you have no idea what my cultural frame of reference is. You don't know. You've got to really ask, what are those things that are meaningful and relevant? And then the teacher makes intentional the explicit connections or the opportunities for students to make those connections to those things in their cultural frame, to the conceptual part of what's supposed to be taught.
Yeah, it makes me wonder why so many educators lack the confidence in themselves. I think it's safe to assert that most the vast majority of teachers go into the profession with this burning desire to make a difference, right? They want to make a difference.
Right.
They have this burning desire to really have an impact, not just a minor difference. They want to
Right.
make a big impact on students, but
Absolutely.
at some point, educators end up they just don't feel like they don't feel confident in themselves. So where do you think that comes from? Where does that sort of get taken away from all of us, where we come into the profession and we're going to make a difference in the lives of the students we teach, and become this leader and create these kinds of cultures, and then at some point we just don't believe we can do it anymore, and we just lack that
Right.
confidence? Where do you think that comes from?
There's so many places. One is their own personal experience. Sometimes they go into teaching really, like you were saying, committed to doing it, but then they all go into a very restricted regiment way that teaching is supposed to be done, whether it's at the middle school, the high school. This is the way we do teaching here, right? And it's very narrow in its format. Now, what winds up happening when it's narrow and you can't start with kids' strengths, you can't talk about it, begin every lesson by watching a video, maybe on something on electronic field trips. We're not supposed to do that because we have these specific, not only the curriculum, but the textbook, and we're supposed to be following the guide to that textbook, which is very restrictive. It's like a couple of people got in a room and thought of the way that they want to introduce, but they don't know the kids who are being taught. And so for me as a teacher, if I'm supposed to be and I'm in a school that they use pacing guides that literally say, you start here, this is the next step, this is the next step. That is so restrictive that first of all, it limits my creativity. But here's the bad rub. What happens is when you're in a restricted curriculum like that, the kids don't respond well. They're not doing well. They're not interested, or they don't then test well. Then it looks like, wow, so it's either me or it's them. And often I'd rather sometimes teachers say it must be them, because I'm also led to believe I'm supposed to look at the data, and the data says they don't do well, or it's me because I'm in this restricted lane that I'm supposed to be in. And, in the book, I use this analogy to swans. I remember watching swans in England and just saying, oh my goodness, they are so majestic in the water. And then as soon as they get out of the water to try to get food from those who are watching, they are ambling and they're falling all over the place. Why? Because they're out of their element. As soon as you put them back in that element where they can flourish, where they connect, where they can glide along, that's what happens with so many children and so many teachers. They're not allowed to be in their element. Those creative ideas that they had when they were student teachers all of a sudden get very restricted. So what does that mean? The other side of it is, what about when you watch some teachers getting chosen to be teachers of the gifted? They're going to be in the gifted program. Then it looks like, well, maybe they're really better teachers than I am. And that's not necessarily true. It could be true. But the cool thing then about gifted land is me going into being a teacher there. I get to try out a lot of different things, right? I get to start with their strengths and move with other kind of enrichment. And what happens? The kids keep doing well. The kids keep doing well while the other kids are in this restricted diet of remediation, or just not being able to explore conceptually, or even getting into the backward planning. Like I know, Jay Victai, and thinking about those essential questions that can really open the mind up of kids. And that's why teachers then feel, well, maybe it's me. So here we go. If you then think about when you are successful, what really happens in those situations? Use your own empirical research. What made you successful with X kids? What kinds of things were you doing with them? And then you start saying, well, wait, when I do them, I do see kids shift into this mode of being motivated. And I feel better then about myself. And I say, okay, I must have really turned it on. So when I wrote Pedagogy of Confidence, it was interesting because people said, well, whose confidence are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about the teachers, I'm talking about the kids, and I'm talking about the leaders in the school, the administrators. What about their confidence? When they're told, wait a second, your school, all the kids aren't doing X, Y, Z. And then what about, you were talking earlier about labels. When you start labeling schools, and all these districts have labels for the underperforming schools, you know, they're always these derogatory labels. Then what happens? And I'm a teacher in that school. I don't feel very good, even if it's on a subconscious basis. It looks like if I'm part of this crew at the school, we must not be good. So there are all these different dimensions, facets to why, which is why I said this has got to be called pedagogy of confidence. You know, the other thing is many, many years ago, I saw Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you know, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Paulo Freire's book. And I remember hearing Paulo Freire, and he was talking about that, but then he went from his second book after Pedagogy of the Oppressed was called Pedagogy of Hope. And I heard him talking, and I remember saying, you know, but you got to have more than hope. It's like for teachers have to have a sense of confidence in terms of, yes, there's a biological construct to hope that's very powerful, but you've got to be in the other lane. You've got to be really confident about this to move on. And that was really the genesis of the title, to say, this is where we have to operate from. And if we provide these kinds of experiences, the feedback that the students are going to be giving to us about our pedagogical choices will enhance our confidence.
Yeah, it's you talked about labels and terminology. And you talk about teachers at times feeling as if they can't make a difference, or it must be them. And then what that ends up leading to are some of the terms, as you mentioned, the labels that we throw around. I'm actually struck by, you know, the number of labels or euphemisms that are used in our system. Words like urban, inner city, low achiever, free and reduced lunch is the one that I get a lot. When I meet people and we're talking about setting up a professional learning experience, and they tell me about their school, it's one of the first things they tell me is, here's the percentage of students that are on free and reduced lunch. And for some of them, I can tell that it's almost a way for them to say, hey, Tom, you know, keep your expectations, you know, under wraps, because you got to understand what we're dealing with, right? So here's my question to you about those labels. How do we break this habit of this coded language? How do we get away from marginalizing and otherizing students through these labels? And how do we bring ourselves back into taking some responsibility for the results, as opposed to staying at arm's length and saying, well, they're low achievers, they're free and reduced lunch, what do you expect us to do? How do we break that habit or that cycle?
Well, the first thing is we must do much more around the science of learning. We need to learn more about the learning process, not just when we're in undergraduate school, because we keep finding out more and more about the science, the neuroscience, the intersection of the neuroscience and the cognitive science around learning. And I believe that the more people really understand how the brain operates in the learning process, the more then you really will see where those labels don't hold true. Because what we're learning about how the brain functions, why the brain needs enrichment, what happens when the brain has access to enrichment, everybody's brain, that's one thing. So if we were told, so listen to this, suppose government started saying, we're going to be funding your school district based on the amount of strengths that you find in children, in their strengths, what you find as strengths. All of a sudden, what would happen? There would be a shift, and people would start saying, wait, how do we identify the strengths? What would be the best way to show those strengths? Because all of a sudden, that's the focus. So that's the beginning of starting to break down the use of those other kinds of labels, because now we're going to have an assets focus, which means we
Right.
got to start using terminology that's assets focused, right? That's
Right.
that's going to be the first thing. The second thing is, the more we learn about the brain, that we will understand that behind my exterior color, you and I have the exact same color brain.
Right.
Brains are all gray. It's brain matter, right? It's gray matter. Now, if that's the case, and we all have our brains are colored, the propensity of our brains is the same. How they develop is different because of whatever experiences we have. But even Jean Piaget was the one who said, look, if you want high level performance, you need high level activities. You use low level activities, that's what you're going to get, because the task precedes the performance. It is really looking at how we put that task. So when you moving away from labels means, what is it that we're really trying to, first of all, what's our belief in the capacity of the brain? If we really believe this, then our whole philosophy and the language we use really has to shift. It's got to shift to match that philosophy. And that's why I start always by saying, if we were getting money for doing that, all of a sudden the labels would really shift fast. You would really see that. And then the things that otherwise kids would become extinct. It would really be more around, what do we do to engage kids so we can identify more of those strengths and abilities? And that's the kind of shift that we're trying to push through. Even why I use the idea of the metaphor of gifted education for equity consciousness, because then if you're focused on really thriving, flourishing in the gifts, even those things that are barriers, you'll still look for, because you want to ensure that we are accessing and turning on that brain. But that's the beginning. You got to understand more about the brain. If you understood, you would understand why culture is so important. It's not because culture is not race, right? So culture is really about experiences, and those things that I said earlier that are meaningful and relevant, and those experiences set up particular neural patterns that when you are then using those patterns, you really see a very much more expressive, demonstrative side to the propensity of the brain, which is why when we talk about culturally relevant teaching, it isn't about, because we have these kids of color. Because Lev Vygotsky was the first one to really talk about the impact of culture on learning. And he, when you talk about culture, language, and cognition, he was the first one to say that culture and language are what come together to help a person express him or herself in the world through their cognitive, intellectual abilities. And so it is that culture that really helps turn on the performance of kids when you make those links.
Yeah, you write so eloquently about that in the book. You talk about relevance and meaningfulness are contextualized and influenced by one's culture, and that culture creates this emotionally laden frame of reference that we all construct meaning through, right? So this is how you visualize that through culture and language is how meaning is constructed. So can we dig a little bit deeper on that? Just talking about that interconnectedness between culture, language, and cognition, and really the influence that culture and language have, and it being different, as you say, than race, and how culture influences our thinking.
Right. Well, first of all, culture molds language. The language that you use to express yourself are based on the culture that has really affected your cognition, how you make meaning, the way you put ideas together, the way you infer, the way that you even sequence often is very much affected by your culture, what you think is most important, meaningful, and valuable. So that's what's going on. And like I said, culture, when you think about, well, what really is culture? Well, we know it's what's meaningful and relevant, but we also know that culture is displayed through rituals, through traditions, and rituals and traditions are repeated patterns. That's why they're called that. We do them over. And so what happens when you are dealing through traditions and ritual is, as I was saying a little while ago, you are creating specific neural patterns that come through certain kinds of repetition and certain kinds of appreciation. One culture, one group of people may appreciate baseball dramatically, and then there are other cultures who sports aren't that important. There are other things that they see as important, references. And then what happens is there's language that then is used to express the cognition, the meaning that you're making. And that's why culture is affecting the language. But the reverse is true as well, that language can affect culture. So what do I mean? Here's an example in the education parlance. So all of those terminology that we use, like minority, like disabled, like disadvantaged, they are language that put a specific cultural implication at work. Once that language happens and is used repeatedly, there's a culture that takes place. That's why we have a culture of looking at low performance and just assuming that that means that these are kids who are in the gap. So that's, so that's where language then affects culture, meaning the pattern, the way people are looked at, the way we choose or don't choose particular strategies, all came and got started because of the language. So I remember I got a letter, an email last year from a particular state in the country, because it was the state ed department. And they said, Dr. Jackson, we've read a lot about your work, and we have a lot of kids who are in the subgroup, and we would love for you to come. We think that you could have something to contribute, especially when it comes to subgroups and kids of color. And I am telling you, I read that and I said, all right, my first thought was, I'm not going to this place, because there was such a comfort in even coming to me and saying subgroup. Now, why? That's what we talked about earlier. It's a federal term. It's a term, right? But it still has an implication. There's a meaning behind that. So I wrote them back and I said, let me tell you my philosophy. And I told them all this pedagogy of confidence, all kids are wired. And I said, I just have to say that if I come, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about these labels like subgroup, minority, marginalization, that kind of thing. And I'm going to say that we don't use that language and why that's important. Anyway, make a long story. I said, now, based on the fact that I've shared my philosophy, if you're still interested in having me come, we can talk. Well, I never heard from them again. But my point is that the language was used with such comfort and ease that sets and shows a particular cultural reference. And that's why I said culture is not race, but how people look at race is very cultural, right? And so when you talk about that in terms of the impact of culture on cognition, it's what the brain is hearing, how it's making the meaning. That is why even very young kids, they get into this idea of what's called, Carol Dweck talked about the entity theory, where so many kids believe intelligence is fixed. Like, I just don't have it. I just am not smart as the other. Or they're very much familiar with the idea of attributional references, where they're saying, well, my ability to success or fail is based on, and it's whatever they've been trained to believe. It's based on my color. It's based on where I grew up. It's based on the fact that I just don't know. That's the kind of thinking that comes from the culture, the language that then affects a cultural pattern, then that is going to affect my cognition and how I'm thinking and making meaning and even seeing myself, my identity. So that is really that intersection. Now, the other side of that is, how do you use culture in teaching? Well, when we start conceptually, as I mentioned earlier, big ideas, not topics, but in other words, saying to teachers, what do you want kids to really understand, students to understand at the end of this lesson? What's the big concept? The broader the concept, the more connections students can make, regardless of where they're from, what they've been exposed to. The more narrow the concept, where it's a topic. So by choosing very broad topics and then saying to kids, what do you know about this? Like, even whether it's migration, whether it's looking at it in terms of change, whether it's measurement, kids at 4 and 5-year-old they can tell you about measuring things, even though they may be totally off on inches or something, but they understand this is what you do to make something thick, right? Okay, so the idea here is, by getting a cultural reference, knowing more about what kids already are thinking about this, what they've been exposed to, I can then use many more connections to going further in the teaching of that concept, so they get it. So when kids say to a teacher, I don't get it, they're not kidding. They just don't get it. It's like, conceptually, you gotta connect me. It has to be contextualized more. And that's what Vygotsky was talking about when he talked about the zone of proximal development. It's like, how do I bring this closer to my sense of experience?
I love the reference in the book to the new hip hop. Love that. High intellectual performance through high operational practices. And so as we finish up here, I've got a couple more questions for you. Those high operational practices. So we've got identifying and activating student strengths, building relationships, eliciting high intellectual performance, providing enrichment, integrating prerequisites for academic learning, situating learning in the lives of students, and amplifying student voice. So my question to you is, okay, so a teacher is ready to sort of rethink and reimagine what their classroom could look like. Where do they start? What with those 7 practices? Is there a most efficient and effective place to begin, or is it always context dependent? Where should a teacher begin?
Well, first, I always say begin with strengths, because that's the place people don't usually start, right? They're starting thinking more about it in terms of, where do I start based on this curriculum? Where do I start? And I'm saying, first of all, you have to really identify and understand student strengths. Now, how do we identify the strengths? Well, this is where it gets curriculum oriented. First, we can ask kids about their strengths, right? What do you think you're really good at? Problem with that, though, is there are so many children. So I will tell you, I was doing some co-teaching. This was just a couple of years ago, in a middle school in a very urban area. And my partner, the woman I was working with, what our goal was to have teachers and students come together for pedagogy, meaning for professional development. Teachers and students were going to be in professional development sessions together. Why? When we talked about learning and the brain and how the learning happens, why shouldn't kids know how the brain works too? I mean, we teach them about all these other things, even supposed to get into biology, and we mention the brain, we mention the parts of the brain, what it does, but we don't talk about how learning really happens. And the more kids understand about how learning happens, the more then they can be self-determined for, what can I do to make my learning stronger? So that's the other thing about, we were in this situation, we were going to be getting kids ready. I worked with, it was 2 days in a row that we were going to be with these middle school kids, about 24. I worked with the kids on the first day. My partner's working with the teacher. The second day, we're bringing students and teachers together to learn more about, and literally kids learned the term pedagogy, what pedagogy meant, what goes into a good lesson, what can students and teachers do together to design a lesson. Kids can tell teachers what engages other kids. They can say where the best kind of priming activity could be. But here we go back to the, where do you start? So the second day I was with the kids, before we went to meet with the teachers, I said, I'd like you to identify what your strengths are. I'm sharing this because I said, ask them what their strengths are. 24 kids in the class, 21 of them, I asked them to do a bubble map. That's a David Hirely's thinking maps, and they were supposed to put their 21 kids had nothing in their bubbles. 21.
Wow.
Now, why? Because they never, ever, one, they were never asked that. They were never asked to consider their strengths. Second, because they were never asked, they didn't think they had any strengths. So this is what wound up happening. And this is, again, I'm saying this because when we say, where do you start? I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I am going to go around the room to all 24 of you, and I am going to give you a strength that I notice coming from you. And I've only been with you one full day because I was with you. All right. So I go around. Now, first of all, as I'm going around, you should have seen their body language. Everybody is sitting up because they know it's going to be good. I said, I'm going to bring you a strength. I didn't. So, I could have said the opposite. I'm going to tell you what you're doing wrong. All right. I'm telling them that. So this one child, I tell her name is Tasha, you're really a very responsible person. So I go around the room. Now, what winds up happening is in 5 minutes, I ask them to now share their bubble maps. You should have seen, it was an explosion on the paper. They were coming up with everything from competitive to mature to artistic. I mean, they were going, I have a good humor, whatever it is. But you see, that's not enough. When you're doing that kind of identification, it has to be for a purpose too. How are you going to use your strengths? How are you going to develop your strengths? How did you develop the strength to begin with? But I want to just share this. I said I might share something with you. So at the end, this is very short. I asked the kids, okay, I want you to write how you're going to use your strengths to be a leader. So this is that one child who I said was responsible. She says, my strengths can help me to be a leader because when I was little, I was shy and very quiet. But as I grow older, I gain some strengths. These 6 strengths are athletic, competitive, mature, responsible, which she underscores. Remember, this is the one I gave her. Intelligent. They're going to help me grow as a person because as a basketball player, you need discipline. You need to be competitive, and mainly you have to be mature. They have helped me as a leader because I share these things with my friends, teachers, and family members. I give them great advice. And as a leader, you have to make sure that you lead other people to being a leader someday. Now, I share that with you because, first of all, we're talking social emotional learning. We're talking about attentiveness. We're talking about attributional theory. We're talking about all this. Now, though, pedagogically, how do you identify strengths? That's why when I was talking to you about starting with broad concepts, as you're working on your lesson development, you say, what am I going to use? There are 3 facets: priming, processing, and retaining for understanding. So in each element, each section of this planning, we have to constantly be saying, how do we learn more about the strengths within those kids? In the priming, I'm introducing whatever the big concept is, and I start identifying and asking kids, one, what they already know about it. Why do they know it? What kinds of experiences? Give me some examples of it. And you will be surprised. We don't know what kids know until we really ask them. And so many kids have had all kinds of experiences outside of school that have really influenced not only their knowledge, but where they really happen to be strong. So when I'm working with teachers and we're talking about identifying strengths, it really is, what is the kind of opportunity in the learning process where I can assess where they're really developing, what they're showing some real amplitude. So that's why I say start with strengths. The other one, though, is situating learning in the lives of students. When we make those connections between the realities, kids really love current events, not the old way where you say, okay, but really what's happening in the world? What have you heard? Let's talk, especially now with COVID, with all of these things, with using the media, that kind of thing. But when you're doing that and you're starting there, you also think about prerequisites. What are the prerequisites I should be exposing kids to? So when I'm priming them, they can be very strong. How are they connected? How do I integrate in the processing high level strategies that get to higher order thinking? How do I get them into more critical analysis, more comparative behavior, more evaluation and critique? Those are high levels of, and if the kids, as I'm introducing them and using these kind of strategies that elicit that, I'm really demonstrating or getting to identify where kids are strong. So when you say, where do you start? It really doesn't matter where you start, but I start with strengths, like I said, for the reasons that I already shared. Yeah. But the one area that really pushes forward as I close there is this idea of a student voice, right? Amplifying student voice. So that experience where I told you that I was in this city where we were then having teachers and students come together for professional development, that is a strong example of amplifying the voice of students. So what kind of things happen as a result of students and teachers learning together? Language changes. This is back to language and culture. What do I mean? They started using neurotransmitters, neurogenesis, the idea of a pedagogical practice, the idea of wait time, attentiveness, all this language that they were learning together became a new shared language, which then was the result of a new culture. And that's where we get into this idea of the impact of giving kids voice in terms of their kinds of experiences. And
yeah. I think your your point about beginning with strengths is really critical. I think that just centers everything around unlocking for students their internal belief about, I have strengths, here's what they are, here's how I capitalize on them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Listeners, the book is Pedagogy of Confidence. It is a must read as far as I'm concerned. So if you haven't read the book yet, please, I would encourage you to really get the book and just consume every ounce of it. It is for me required reading for any educator. Now, before we pivot here to maybe having a little bit of a lighter conversation, Yvette, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education. Tell us a little bit about that organization.
Sure. The National Urban Alliance really started as a partnership with Teachers College at Columbia University, Simon and Schuster, and a couple of other partners, where the idea, and this was in the 80s is when it started, the idea was, how do we work with school districts to move away from a deficit model, to really think about how we get to learn about learning and thinking at high levels, and to use that as a way, especially to kind of counter the negative or deficit narrative. And so the president of Teachers College, like I said, Simon Schuster, these people got together, Gus Hawkins, whom I talked about earlier, got together and said, well, what then becomes our focus? You know, the idea of focusing on thinking, high levels of thinking really became its major focus at that point. And then again, what would happen is we would say, well, how do you really ensure that we can change this deficit? It has to be through professional learning. So the guide, or I would say the goal of the National Urban Alliance, was then high levels of professional learning experiences with applications back into the classroom that then centered focus on high levels of thinking. So being, again, very Piagetian, being my teachers, being an intricate player in this work, became the work of the National Urban Alliance. And then what wound up happening is, it was really interesting because when George Bush, the second George Bush, became the president, he really came up with this No Child Left Behind policy, which was really another iteration of Title I, and it still looked at deficits. And we became very strong then as an entity, because districts started reaching out and saying, well, wait a minute, how do we then look at the idea of focusing on thinking so that we can move students at more of an accelerated rate. And that is when the National Urban Alliance really blossomed to this entity that was working in many states with this real focus on mediation, what we do to really constantly assess high levels of thinking during the learning and teaching process, and even saying learning and teaching and not teaching and learning, which meant that the emphasis would also be how do we frame our work in the whole idea of especially cognitive science at that time, because we were talking about thinking itself, but then moving it into substantiation with the neuroscience. So National Urban Alliance is still very much alive and well, and so much of its work now also is using this idea of equity consciousness to still push forward the way I described the goal, the mission of the organization. So I have remained on as a senior scholar. I was the CEO and then became the senior scholar when I also decided to do a lot more teaching at the higher ed level, being at Columbia, which gave just different kind of purview. But I can tell you that I still work with them. It still gives me access to working with teachers in the classroom, to students, the work that they're doing. And when we talk about student voice and having students really be part of the professional learning is a big thrust of the National Urban Alliance. And the work is really amazing. So if you ever go on the website, you'll see examples. You'll see the Tasha that I was talking about, a lot of examples of strategies to be used, and just amazing pedagogical connections that they're able to still pull forward.
This has been an incredibly informative and inspiring conversation, and I feel like we have just scratched the surface.
Started. Yeah, I'm going to interview you next on your own show. That's going to be my job.
No, I think I'm going to use that as an excuse to have you back at some point, because I feel like there are great ways for us to dig even deeper and really explore some of these concepts at a more intimate level. I could listen to you all day, that's for sure. So we're going to pivot to a little bit of fun here, and I've got one final question as well. So as listeners know, I always finish up every interview with a segment called 3 Questions, which are some very lighthearted, kind of easy kinds of questions that a chance for people to get to know you a little bit on a personal level, nothing too intrusive, but just a chance for us to lighten the conversation a little bit as we go. So I am going to begin with the first question, and the first question is sweet or savory? Are you a sweet person? Do you have a sweet tooth, or are you more drawn to the savory?
See, I love chocolate, so but I'm really more into savory. I love savory. I love spicy food. I love the combination of the food. I think some of that is from my very mixed heritage of bringing those kinds of varied spices together, but I'm savory.
You're a savory. Okay. Second one. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Definitely morning. I'm like 5:36 in the morning. I just naturally get up. It's a much quieter time for me. And in the evening, I'm exhausted. So I'm I'm the AM person.
Yeah, I've always been a morning person as well for a long time. And of course, living on the West Coast, so much happens earlier in the morning that you end up having to be up earlier. That's for sure.
That's true. Good point.
All right. The third one is, if you were forced to, and both of these would be full throttle, if you were forced to, which would you rather be forced to do? To sing along to every song you heard, or to dance to every song you heard? Which one would you rather be forced to do?
I'd be dancing.
Dancing.
I wanted to be a dancer, so I love dancing. And if you heard my voice, my mother's words were, not a good idea. Not a good idea. And she was right. I do not sing, but I do love dance.
Love to dance. So you say you wanted to be a dancer. Is there dance in your background? Were you a dancer when you were young? Did you take dance?
I studied dance when I was very little. I mean, seriously dancing. And then I stopped. When I went to graduate school, I took dance again at Columbia, as a matter of fact. but I was teaching, I would teach dance as an extracurricular in the school that I
Okay.
taught at. I was like in charge of the dance program at the school.
Okay.
And then when I got a little bit older, I studied at the Alvin Ailey School, which is a very big dance school. So, but I never, ever got to really be the dancer.
My daughter was a dancer, and we did
Oh, really?
just in her younger days. She's more an actor now and more in the world of fashion. But it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned Alvin Ailey, because we her dance studio took a trip to New York one year, and they took some training at the Alvin Ailey studio. Really, really great. So as we finish up, I have a question I ask all interviewees. I ask this question of everyone, and that is about your definition of success and happiness. It's a theme I'm running through the podcast. And so my question really is, if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them? What's your version of what success is?
My definition of success is happiness. If a person is really considers themselves a happy person, then they've been very successful in many, many areas, whether it's both professionally at home, with the family, with extracurricular activities. They do the things that they're passionate about, which then makes them feel this sense of happiness, which you got to be in a certain frame of mind and have had the kind of opportunities that have allowed you to pursue those things that you love, so that you are happy, which to me then is I've been successful. So it's not quantitative. It really is more about, have I been able to do the things that really turn me on, and across the areas, then I can say, and I am a really happy person. And I think that that is something that was what I shared with my students when I had my own kids in schools, and I try to share in districts, because I'm very turned on by this. So that's it. If you're happy, you got to be successful.
It's interesting how so many just look at, it's not about the accolades, it's not about the awards, it's not about the money. It's that internal sense of happiness and contentment or satisfaction, or however you want to call it. It really does make a difference.
Absolutely.
This really, honestly, this has been just a tremendous pleasure for me. Now, Yvette, you are not really active on social media, so I'm wondering if you could let listeners know, if they want to follow your work, what's the best way to sort of follow you, or the best way to get in touch with you if they're interested in having you work with their school or their district or what have you? What's the best way to follow you?
Well, and you're right. I was going to say I could give you my Instagram address, but you're right. I rarely post, but really you could go to the National Urban Alliance website, because anything that I'm either writing or actively engaged in, they really do post on the website. And then you'd also find some other very interesting, wonderful things, but that's the best way to see what I'm doing. To get in touch with me, you can either go through that email website also, or you can go through the Teachers College website, which is where it's YFJ1 at teacherscollege@columbiauniversity.org.
Okay. Listeners, I'll make sure.
Yeah, he'll get it right. You can see that often either.
That's right. I'll put the email address in the show notes, so listeners, you can take a look at there. And the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education website, that's www.nuatc.org to check out Yvette's work there. Yvette, this was truly an honor to have you on the podcast, and I really look forward to next time. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. See you in Atlanta.